I want to say, and this is very important, at the end, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war.
The Cold War marked a turning point between the U.S. and the Soviets that originally started in 1947 and progressed all the way to the early 90s. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the USSR, was trying to persuade and expand the idea of communism throughout Europe. Communism is a form of government where the property is publicly owned and each person is paid according to their needs. The United States were against this idea of communism and strongly believed that government should have some sort of democracy to prevent one ruler from having all the power. Knowing this feud occurred during the time of the Bay and Pigs invasion, it caused Khrushchev to unite with Fidel Castro to battle the common enemy, which in this case was the United States. Khrushchev's plan was to try and ship and assemble nuclear missiles in Cuba that could easily reach the United States, which would intimidate the country and have Kennedy come to some sort of agreement that would benefit both the Soviets and the communist nations. Although Castro and the entire country of Cuba wanted to go to war, Khrushchev was not willing to do so. This plan was completely shut down days later when the U.S. surrounded Cuba and prevented nuclear weapons from going in.
Although compromise was partially responsible for the triumph of the Cuban Missile Crisis, nuclear holocaust was ultimately avoided due to good providence, despite mistrust tragically brewing among world superpowers attributed to the rising tensions that took place during the Cold War.
The infamous morning of October 16, 1962, marked the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when John F. Kennedy informed his close advisors that pictures of Cuba taken by a U-2 spy plane had showed what photographic intelligence interpreters had thought to be the beginning of the construction of the Soviet intermediate-range missiles. John F. Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States, elected in 1961, and left office when his life was cut tragically short in 1963, where he was assassinated. The missiles that were being shipped in Cuba were mentioned by John F. Kennedy in his address to the American people.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Weeks earlier, Robert Kennedy had met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin to discuss a potential atmospheric ban test treaty. Anatoly claimed that President Kennedy had no need to be concerned about missiles entering Cuba, as he was told by Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev that there would be no offensive weapons placed in Cuba. The morning of October 16, 1962, proved all of what he had said was lies, as representative of the CIA displayed the U-2 photographs exhibiting the placement of missiles and the construction of sites in Cuba. On this fateful morning, it was then and there that a rift had been cut between the two superpowers, along with the beginning of a long line of deceit and mistrust.
Adlai Stevenson, an American lawyer, questioned the Soviets at a conference located in London, England.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba?
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does.
This was an important moment because the U.S. finally understood that they were placing and assembling nuclear weapons in Cuba. The Spanish-American War was a battle between Spain and America that took place from April 21st to August 13th, 1898. The United States was angered when their vessel, the USS Maria, was destroyed by the Spanish in a Havana harbor, killing 264 men on board. As a result, the United States lashed out by fighting over land in Latin America, including Cuba. However, the U.S. passed a petition called the Platt Amendment, which granted the Cubans protection of their independence in exchange that the U.S. was able to lease or buy land for naval bases. This angered the Cubans because they felt as if their independence was being violated, which caused people like Fidel Castro to revolt and reshape the Cuban government.
The United States' relationship with Cuba has been strained ever since Fidel Castro overthrew the former leader Fulgencio Batista. Batista was the president of Cuba from 1933 to 1944, and also from 1952 to 1959. When Batista was president of Cuba, he was actually supported by the United States. The United States backed up Batista because he allowed the U.S. to hold properties and businesses in Cuba. The Cuban land was perfect for sugarcane, which is very popular in the United States. The United States' poor relationship with Cuba began once Batista was overthrown during the Cuban Revolution. Once Batista was overthrown, Fidel Castro took his place. The United States immediately hated Castro when he took over in Cuba. Years later, on April 17, 1961, the U.S. attacked Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro and the Cuban government. The U.S. underestimated the land and power of the Cuban military and were forced out of Cuba. This infamous attack is called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Ultimately, the plan failed, and in retaliation, Cuba asked for help from the communist allies, the Soviets. Khrushchev was more than happy to help Cuba and secretly delivered nuclear parts to Cuba. With this newly formed alliance between Fidel Castro and the Soviet Union, President Kennedy was forced to take immediate action. Kennedy held a conference to decide the best course of action. The final decision was to create a military-naval blockade of 40 U.S. warships that would prevent all nuclear weapons and construction parts from reaching Cuba, while everyday essentials such as food, water, and oil were allowed to pass through. Kennedy decided to take this course of action because he felt it would lead to a more peaceful outcome. Kennedy triumphantly put the needs of the nation first by making a politically unpopular decision and risking his position in the White House as midterm elections were just a month away. At 7 p.m. on October 22, 1962, John F. Kennedy made his address to the American people on national television. Kennedy's address held numerous purposes within its 29 paragraphs, one being a warning to the Soviets, assuring them that the quarantine is only the beginning, and if the Soviets were to continue with construction of missile sites, then further action would be justified.
Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified.
Kennedy's address to the American people was the first time the crisis was disclosed to the public, and the goal was to inform without causing widespread panic. Despite the president's best efforts, his speech was still described by historian Michael Beschloss as one of the most alarming speeches ever given by a president.
For months, U.S. aircrafts have been flying dangerously low over Cuba, gathering photographic intelligence as well as causing dread to fall over the Cubans because they believed that they could be bombed at any time. Soviet soldiers shot down the U-2 spy plane. This alarmed Khrushchev because he had given no such orders and was worried that the Soviet troops had begun taking commands from the Cuban leaders. On October 27, 1963, the 11th day of the crisis, a Soviet submarine was hit with weak depth charges by the U.S. Navy in order to signal the submarine to the surface. However, the Soviets on board believed that they were under attack, leading them to think that war had started. This was when the world was only seconds away from nuclear annihilation, only to be saved by pure luck. Most submarines only have the captain and political officer to approve the launching of the missiles, but luckily the flotilla commander, Vasily Arpivov, was aboard the submarine and triumphantly vetoed the launch.
The beginning of the end of the crisis occurred on October 24th, when Khrushchev sent a calm letter with the general message that the Soviet Union was ready to reach an agreement. Khrushchev had realized that there could not be a war as there would be far too many casualties. The agreement that Khrushchev wished to reach was that the Soviet Union would withdraw their missiles as long as Kennedy promised to never attack Cuba again. On October 27th, Kennedy was prepared to accept Khrushchev's conditions when a second letter arrived, with new terms. This second letter has the additional requirements that the missiles placed in Turkey and Italy by the U.S. must be removed. Khrushchev's second letter was much more abrupt and threatening than the first.
The Soviets agreed to take nuclear weapons out of Cuba provided that the U.S. removed their missiles out of Turkey. The U.S. agreed to this compromise because this would mean there is no longer a nuclear threat in Cuba. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union actually improved. The superpowers realized that they needed to limit nuclear arms from both countries. Future presidents such as Richard Nixon worked to the end of the Cold War. In 1972, the SALT I Treaty was signed, limiting the number of missiles each country could have. The tensions could have called for nuclear weapons which would have destroyed the world. We can relate this to the threat with North Korea here in the United States. Although it is unclear on how developed North Korea's weapons truly are, could perhaps some of the lessons learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis apply to the situation or similar situations in the future? Will the leaders of both countries learn from the crisis and compromise?
Bring integration, but look what it's done for the voter registration.